Do you think a long marriage will last forever? For me, 30 years together wasn't a beautiful ending. It was the beginning of an entirely new journey. Why did I decide to get divorced after retiring? Let me tell you my story. My name is Linda. I'm 58 years old and recently retired after more than 35 years in the banking industry. Over those years, I built not just a career but a family. My husband, Mark, and I got married when I was 28. In those early years, we had everything: a spacious home, 2 beautiful children, and the stable life I had always dreamed would last forever. Outside of work, my life revolved around my family. I cared for my husband and children, making sure everything at home ran smoothly. Mark, like so many men, wasn't the most romantic, but he was thoughtful and dependable. To me, he was the ideal man, the kind who took care of his family and stood by me through every challenge life threw our way. And yet, when I officially retired, a strange and unsettling feeling started to rise inside me. In those first days after leaving work, I realized something. I no longer found joy in living alongside the man who had shared 3 decades of my life. It wasn't that he had done anything wrong. It was that somewhere along the way, I had lost myself. Our marriage had become like 2 lifeless shadows, no real joy, no heartfelt conversations. I started to ask myself, had I truly lived my own life, or had I just lived according to other people's expectations? Had I forgotten who I was beneath the roles of wife and mother? Those questions kept circling through my mind, growing louder each day until I could no longer ignore them. When I was still working, I had always thought our marriage was a model partnership, 2 people facing life together, raising children and building a home. But once I retired, time seemed to stretch out endlessly, and I began to see just how distant we had become. Mark and I hardly talked anymore. He buried himself in his work or his hobbies. Meanwhile, I felt like a shadow sitting beside him, a quiet figure in a still painting, no longer playing any real part. I tried to start conversations, but his answers were always short, distracted, and lacking in warmth. I could tell he felt it too, the exhaustion, the disconnection. I began to think about things I had never dared to face before. Was I just living out of responsibility and habit instead of truly living for myself? Mark was still the man I once loved, but what we shared no longer brought me joy or fulfillment. Day after day, I felt myself trapped in a marriage I could no longer sustain. Could I really continue living like this for the sake of safety or for the kids? Or did I have the right to seek a new life where I could reclaim who I was? One day, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized, if I didn't change something, I would spend the rest of my life emotionally numb. I didn't want that. I needed to act. I began asking myself, was it time to end this marriage? I didn't want to live out my remaining years trapped in a dull existence with someone I no longer felt truly connected to. But was divorce too drastic, too late? Did I have the courage to face such a huge change, especially now, without the structure and security of work to fall back on? I thought about what life would look like after divorce. How could I start over when my finances mostly depended on a modest pension and a home filled with decades of memories? Would I be able to live independently, build a new life, and find joy again at this age? And I couldn't help but worry about how my family and friends would react. What would they think if I divorced after so many years together? Could I handle the judgment from people I loved and respected? And what about my children? Would they understand and support my decision? All these thoughts spun around in my head with no clear answers in sight. Part of me wanted to stay in the safety of the familiar, even if it meant being unhappy. But another part of me, a deeper, truer part, knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Why should I live a life without true joy just to protect the appearance of a perfect family? The biggest question of all was, am I strong enough to leave, to rediscover myself, and to live the life I truly deserve? After months of soul-searching, I finally made my decision. I would divorce. Not because I hated Mark or no longer cared about him, but because I loved myself more. I could no longer spend my days merely existing, without connection, without real happiness. This decision didn't come from anger or resentment. It came from a deep, quiet knowing that I had lived for others for far too long, and now it was time to live for myself. I realized that if I ever wanted to keep growing and to find true joy again, I had to create space for it. I needed freedom from old patterns, from old expectations. There were many sleepless nights when I questioned if I was doing the right thing. But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who was tired and hollow. And I knew I couldn't live that way anymore. I wanted to do something just for myself, to rediscover freedom, to feel alive again. Even if I couldn't predict what the future would hold, one thing was certain. I couldn't keep living a life that wasn't truly mine. So I started making plans. I didn't want to rush into anything, but I also didn't want to drag out a marriage that no longer brought happiness to either of us. I needed to prepare myself, mentally, emotionally, and financially for a new life. A life I hoped would bring me real freedom and meaning. This wasn't an easy decision. But I knew that sometimes finding yourself requires having the courage to change, even if that change means facing fears and challenges you never imagined. When I finally decided to divorce, I knew I couldn't navigate all the complex emotions alone. I started reaching out for support, to close friends, to people I trusted to understand and not judge me. But I quickly realized not everyone would see it the way I did. One of the first people I talked to was Emma, my best friend from college. I told her about the feeling of leaving a marriage after 30 years. But instead of supporting me, she looked worried. "Linda, don't rush into anything," she said. "You're retired now. Life can still be stable if you just hold on." Things had changed. How could I possibly start over? What would my children, my friends think? I didn't want to live alone, did I? I knew Emma was only worried about me, but her concern made me feel like I had to justify my decision. I couldn't deny it. There were moments when fear crept in. Fear of being alone. Fear that I wouldn't have the strength to face all the changes ahead. But the truth was, I couldn't keep living a lie. I also talked to my children, both now grown and living their own lives. One evening we sat down together, and I shared my decision. They were clearly surprised, and although they loved me dearly, they couldn't hide their confusion. "Mom, are you sure?" my daughter said. "I think you could still find a way to fix things." Every word felt like a blow to my heart. I loved them. I didn't want to hurt them, but I also knew I couldn't live my life just trying to please everyone else. I explained to them that this wasn't a betrayal of the family. It was about giving myself a chance to find who I really was again. To live true to myself, instead of forcing myself into a role that no longer made sense. At that moment, I realized something important. Not everyone would understand or support me right away. Sometimes you have to walk alone because not everyone is ready to face change, even when it's what you need most. Even after deciding to divorce and starting the process, conflicting emotions haunted me. Guilt began creeping into my mind, a heavy, dark shadow that followed me all day long. I kept asking myself, am I making a mistake? 30 years is a long time to share a life with someone. Ending it so abruptly could hurt not just me, but Mark, our children, and even our circle of friends. I remembered all the hardships we had overcome together. The long evenings, the conversations, the moments of happiness we had built over the years. Could I truly start over without losing all of that? And if I could, would I have enough courage to face the loneliness, the long nights without someone by my side? Beyond the guilt, a terrifying fear about the future loomed over me. I was a retired woman with no steady income outside of my pension. Would I be able to support myself? Would I have enough strength to rebuild my life when everything had changed? This anxiety felt like an undercurrent, pulling at me every time I thought about the next steps. There were moments when I almost wanted to turn back, to accept a life in a loveless, disconnected marriage just to find peace again. But then I would remind myself, I couldn't live like that anymore. I deserved a new life. A life where I could love myself and find the joy and freedom I had lost for so long. That guilt and fear, as heavy as they were part of the change. They were signs of transformation, painful but necessary. This was the turning point. The only path forward if I wanted to truly live. After making the decision to divorce, things became clearer, but not simpler. We now had to deal with real-world issues, things I had never thought about before, especially dividing our assets and planning for the future financially. Nothing was easy anymore after 30 years of shared life. Mark didn't agree with all the divorce terms from the start. He felt hurt and betrayed, and he couldn't accept splitting the assets fairly. I understood his feelings, but I also knew I couldn't stay trapped in emotional paralysis just because of financial entanglements. Our conversations about the separation became tense, even hostile. Every meeting seemed to end in an argument, with a heaviness that was impossible to avoid. The financial side was complicated too. Now retired, my income mostly came from my pension and a modest amount of savings I had managed over the years. Mark had a larger savings account, but he struggled to understand the stress I was under. We had never discussed financial matters seriously during our marriage, and now, facing separation, I found myself confronting a harsh new reality. Could I afford to live independently? I had to meet with lawyers and financial advisors to ensure everything would be divided fairly. The process wasn't just time-consuming, it was exhausting and overwhelming. Each piece of legal advice reminded me that I was stepping into a whole new world, one where every decision could permanently alter my life. I had to start planning my future in detail. Where would I live? How would I manage my expenses? Could I afford the things I had once depended on Mark to handle? These questions haunted me every day, but deep down I knew, no matter how difficult it was, I couldn't go back. I had to face this reality, no matter how painful and challenging it would be, because this change, as hard as it was the only way I could rebuild the life I truly wanted. Once the first steps toward asset division and preparing for my new life were underway, I realized something. The hardest part wasn't the legal process or the financial negotiations. It was finding myself again in a world that felt entirely unfamiliar. I had spent my whole life caring for my family, supporting Mark, always trying to keep everything stable for everyone else. Now, I had to stand on my own. And that made me feel not just confused, but deeply alone. I started focusing on reclaiming my independence. Not just financially, but emotionally, too. One of the first steps I took was enrolling in personal finance classes. At first, it was intimidating. I felt self-conscious and out of place. But I realized I had to equip myself with new skills to manage my finances, especially now that I could no longer rely on anyone else. I turned to books, online resources, and even workshops to learn about budgeting, investing, and saving. Though I wasn't instantly good at any of it, I felt a new kind of freedom, a sense of empowerment. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't depending on anyone else. I was learning, growing, and with every passing day, I could feel myself getting stronger. At the same time, I started taking better care of myself. I joined yoga classes, went for long walks outdoors, and built small habits to recharge my energy. For so long, I had put everyone else's needs before my own. Now, it was time to realize that I deserved moments of peace and self-care too. And through all this, I reconnected with a few old friends, people I had lost touch with over the years. That helped me rebuild a sense of community and reminded me that it wasn't too late to create new bonds, new memories, and a new life. The social network not only helped me realize that life goes on, but also that new opportunities are always waiting. They weren't just friends, they became a tremendous source of encouragement on this journey. Every small step I took helped me feel more confident. I no longer felt dependent on a relationship or someone else's care. Instead, I was someone searching for a new path, a life of independence that I had always dreamed of but never dared to pursue. This journey of rebuilding myself was anything but easy, but I knew I was moving in the right direction. I was reconstructing my life with my own two hands, and slowly, I began to realize that I deserved a new life, a life that I could decide for myself and create on my own terms. One of the biggest challenges I faced in rebuilding my life was confronting the past. Memories of 30 years spent with Mark were not easily erased. Even though the decision to divorce had been made, I couldn't avoid thinking about the happy moments and the memories that had been part of me for so many years. There were nights when I sat alone by the window, overwhelmed by sadness. I asked myself if I could ever forgive myself for my mistakes and whether I could truly leave the past behind to step into a new future. One of the hardest things to come to terms with was the feeling of failure in my marriage. 30 years is a long time, and ending it made it impossible not to blame myself for what I hadn't done, the wrong decisions I made, and the missed opportunities. Even though I logically understood that a relationship couldn't survive without love, my heart still carried wounds that I didn't know how to heal. I decided to join a therapy program, not to criticize or blame Mark, but to better understand myself. During my first session, I felt anxious and a bit skeptical. But gradually, I realized that facing the past and dealing with unresolved emotions was a crucial step toward moving forward. I learned how to forgive myself and Mark. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting everything. Forgiveness means accepting that we can't change the past, and sometimes we need to let go so we don't stay trapped in negative emotions. Forgiveness is freedom. It's how I reclaimed control over my life. And then I realized that to move into a new life, I didn't need to carry the burdens of the past. I needed to learn to love myself and appreciate the lessons that marriage, however painful, had taught me. The past couldn't be changed, but how I faced it would determine my future. It wasn't easy, but little by little, I learned that only by forgiving myself and others could I truly move on and embrace the new opportunities that life had to offer. One of the things I didn't expect after the divorce was the feeling of freedom. Before, I had always thought freedom would be synonymous with loneliness. But strangely, once I was free from a relationship that no longer had love, I began to feel a deep sense of relief. No more arguments, no more financial stress, no more family tensions. I no longer had to worry about responsibilities that no longer belonged to me. All of this gave me the space to focus on myself and the things I had long neglected. As soon as I decided to embrace this change, I began rediscovering the hobbies and joys I had forgotten. I had once loved painting, but for many years, I had pushed it aside, feeling I didn't have the time or the permission to spend moments just for myself. Now, I made time each day to paint, to reconnect with my own creativity. Even though my early paintings were clumsy and imperfect, I felt happy to have returned to that passion. Along with that, I decided to join a morning walking group. It was an activity I had always wanted to do, but never found the time or motivation for. Those early morning walks in the park, surrounded by nature and chatting with new friends, gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Beyond rekindling old hobbies, I also started to refresh my outward appearance. After years of not paying much attention to how I looked, I changed my hairstyle, bought clothes I liked, and felt confident when I looked in the mirror. Every time I caught my reflection, I saw a completely new woman, no longer bound by anything. The change in my appearance was more than skin deep. It marked the beginning of a deeper transformation within me. I also began traveling alone, something I hadn't even considered during my years with Mark. The trips were short and simple, but deeply meaningful. They helped me rediscover the world and rediscover myself. These journeys gave me a true sense of freedom, not as a form of escape, but as a way to keep growing and learning. These seemingly simple things became the building blocks of my new life. I no longer felt like someone forgotten in someone else's story. Now, I was a woman who had reclaimed her joy, her freedom, and most importantly, herself. As I gradually settled into my new rhythm of life, another wonderful thing began to happen. I opened my heart to new relationships. During my marriage, my social world mainly revolved around Mark's family and a few familiar connections. I rarely had the opportunity to build a circle of friends for myself. But now, no longer restricted by old ties, I was free to seek out new connections that matched the person I was becoming. It all started by chance. At a local painting club, I met like-minded friends, people who were also going through major life changes. Some had just divorced, some had retired, and others were simply seeking something new. The club was not just a place to nurture my artistic passion, it became a space where I found understanding and companionship that had been missing from my life for so long. I also began volunteering in my community, something I had always wanted to do but had never acted on. I signed up to help with a children's reading program at the city library. Giving my time and love, seeing the excitement in the children's eyes, reminded me that my worth wasn't just in being a wife or a mother, it was also in my ability to contribute to the world around me. These new connections didn't just bring me daily joy, they opened doors I never even knew existed. A friend from the walking group introduced me to a personal development workshop for women in midlife. There I met extraordinary women who had experienced loss. Cool, transformed, and now rising stronger than ever. Their stories inspired me, and I realized I wasn't alone on this journey. Little by little, these new relationships helped me build a strong support network. None of us were perfect, and that was exactly what connected us. Sincerity, empathy, and a shared belief in new possibilities helped me not only heal old wounds, but also nurture fresh dreams for the future. Life after divorce, which I once thought would be filled with nothing but sadness, ended up giving me a new kind of family, a family built on choice, friendship, and deep understanding. And to me, that is more precious than anything I ever had. As these new bonds began to take root and joy slowly returned to my everyday life, I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving my divorce, I was truly beginning a brand new chapter of my life. And this new chapter deserved new dreams, new goals, shaped by the woman I am today, no longer defined by the shadow of my former marriage. Before, every plan I made was tied to Mark, retirement plans, vacations, dream homes, they were all about us. But now, for the first time, I asked myself a simple yet powerful question. What do I want for myself? I made a list, not a to-do list, but a list of dreams. A small house by the beach where I could fall asleep to the sound of the waves each night. An RV trip across America, visiting the national parks I had only seen in pictures. A pottery class I had always been curious about but never dared to try. And even writing a book about my journey, not to publish, but simply to honor my own story. Of course, making those dreams a reality would require a practical plan. I started working with a financial advisor, reassessing my post-divorce savings, adjusting my budget, and setting new financial goals. I realized that I no longer had to sacrifice my dreams for someone else. Now, every dollar I saved, every decision I made, was for the future I chose. At the same time, I set health goals, yoga 3 times a week, healthier eating, more outdoor activities to keep my body and spirit energized. I was no longer living just for today or trapped in the past. I was caring for the future version of myself. And the biggest lesson I learned through it all was this: it's never too late to dream, to change, or to start again. Divorce didn't end my life. It opened a door I had never imagined, a chance to redesign my life in a way that aligned with my true values, passions, and joys. Things seemed to be settling down. I had new friends, new routines, and a clear plan for the future. But life has a way of testing you right when you think you're finally standing strong. About 6 months after the divorce, I got a call from my lawyer. Mark had filed a motion to reopen our settlement, seeking to adjust the division of assets. The reason? My pension payments had started coming in, something we had previously agreed each of us would keep separately. This time, I wasn't the panicked, sobbing woman I used to be. I sat down with my lawyer, listened carefully, and thought it through. Under U.S. federal law, especially under ERISA and QDRO, Qualified Domestic Relations Order, regulations, pensions can be subject to division if properly claimed. But Mark had signed away his rights in our original agreement. Legally, I had a strong case. But then I asked myself, how much did I really want to fight for this part of my life? Some battles, even when you're right, don't bring peace. I thought about it for many sleepless nights. I remembered why I had gotten divorced in the first place, not for money, but for freedom, peace, and release from the endless cycle of stress and resentment. In the end, I offered a settlement out of court, a small, symbolic payment in exchange for him dropping any future claims. It wasn't because I was weak, it was because I chose peace over bitterness. I chose to truly close the door on the past, clearing the way for whatever lay ahead. When I signed that final agreement, I didn't feel defeated. On the contrary, I felt stronger than ever. I understood that true strength isn't always about fighting to the bitter end. Sometimes, the greatest strength lies in letting go of things that no longer serve your happiness. That decision, to choose peace over victory, became the most pivotal moment in my journey of rebirth. After all the upheaval, challenges, and sleepless nights, one truth stood out clearer than ever. True growth doesn't come from getting everything you want. It comes from understanding what you truly need. Divorcing at 60 wasn't just a legal event. It was a painful transformation of the soul. I lost a 30-year relationship, lost the label of wife that had defined me for most of my life. But as those old layers fell away, I began to see my true self, not for anyone else, not to please anyone, but simply for me. One of the greatest lessons I learned was about the power of personal boundaries. For years, I had put other people's needs above my own, thinking that was love. But sacrifice without respect only leads to depletion. Now, I understood that loving myself was the foundation for loving others in a healthy way. I learned how to say no without guilt. I learned how to listen to my inner voice and honor it. I also discovered the strength of emotional independence. Before, my happiness depended on whether Mark was happy or upset, pleased or disappointed. Now, I know that happiness isn't something that comes from outside. It's a skill you build from within, through daily gratitude, finding joy in small things, and accepting that not every day will be perfect, and that's okay. Another lesson, deceptively simple yet profound. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself. I didn't forgive Mark to excuse what he did. I forgave so I could stop being imprisoned by resentment, so I could walk forward unburdened by the past. Looking back, I find myself grateful for everything, the pain, the heartbreak, the lost sense of direction, because it forced me to face myself, to grow, and ultimately, to start truly living for me. Without that shock of divorce, maybe I would have spent the rest of my life merely existing in a life I never truly chose. As I began to stabilize my heart and rebuild my life, another door quietly opened, the door to new relationships. At first, I admit I was very cautious. 30 years in a marriage, happy or not, had built certain habits, a deep sense of familiarity. Stepping out into the world as a single woman at 60 made me feel both liberated and strangely empty. I was no longer the eager 20-year-old, nor was I naive enough to believe that love alone could solve everything. I understood clearly now, if someone were to come into my life, it wouldn't be to fill a void, but to walk alongside me on this journey. I joined a few local community groups, a book club, a senior yoga class, and some solo travel workshops. At first, I was simply looking for social connection, with little expectation. But to my surprise, it was through these simple conversations, these easy laughs over coffee after yoga class, that I slowly began to rebuild my trust in people. A friend from the book club, who had also recently gone through a divorce, became a close companion. We shared old wounds, new dreams, and encouraged each other to step outside our comfort zones. Together, we planned small trips and weekend getaways, things I once thought were only meant for couples or families. In time, after a long pause, I even allowed myself to date again. Not with the expectation of finding what was lost, but with an open heart, to explore, to converse, to enjoy each moment without burdening it with heavy hopes for the future. A joyful dinner, a concert under the stars, that was enough to warm my heart. The most important lesson I learned was this: new relationships are not meant to replace the past, but to expand our hearts for the present. I no longer needed anyone to rescue me. I was strong enough to stand on my own. And because of that, anyone who entered my life from now on would not be a crutch. They would be a true companion, walking alongside me on the path I had chosen for myself. 3 years after signing the divorce papers, I stood before the mirror in my small apartment in Asheville, North Carolina, a peaceful city I chose to start my new life. The woman looking back at me was no longer the weary, resigned version I once knew. I saw a woman with steady eyes, a serene expression, and a smile carrying a strength forged through many storms. I was no longer someone's wife or half of a 3-decade marriage. I was simply myself, whole, complete, and free. I had learned to love life on my own terms. Mornings were spent leisurely riding my bike through quiet streets, stopping at my favorite cafe to read. Afternoons found me in a painting class, a passion I once abandoned because I didn't have time. On weekends, I sometimes went hiking or attended outdoor music festivals, connecting with vibrant, spirited people. Financially, I wasn't wealthy, but I was free. I knew how to manage my money, invest wisely, and, most importantly, live within my means without feeling deprived. I no longer shopped to numb sadness, nor spent money trying to fill emotional voids. More important than anything, I had found peace. A peace that didn't come from how others treated me, but from how I treated myself, with compassion, patience, and love. Looking back on my journey, I realized that divorce was not a failure. It was the beginning of a better version of myself, a version I never imagined I could become while trapped within old limits. If someone were to ask me, "Do you have any regrets?" I would smile and answer, "No," because in the end, I chose myself.